Good morning. Let's see if that works. And I'm so impressed that we're all here, given the weather. I had to crawl beneath a turnstile in the subway station because the machine didn't deliver tickets. So, you know, Flaubert, this wonderful French writer, has this great image of bourgeois heroism. That's what this is like to me. So I'm really delighted to have this conference. And I cannot say that, that the storm isn't necessarily part of the eco-crisis. It could just be your good old-fashioned bona fide storm. So I don't want, there is a bit of twittering about it being sort of part of the eco-crisis. I'm not so sure. It could or it could not. Open question. Now, before giving, I was going to talk for a bit longer, but I'll make it very short since we start a bit late. I just want to thank a few people. I have a lot of people to thank, but I'm just going to keep it very short. The main person I want to thank is Rebecca Hogan. Rebecca, where are you? She's not here, just when I was thanking her. But she especially, Ben Prosky and Ioanna Tekopoulos, ICER, our co-sponsor, the Institute for Social and Economic Research and Planning. That's a very long name. And then so many others who have helped. So thank you very, very much. If we could lower these slides just a tad up front so that these slides are a bit clearer. I want to sort of develop this notion. It's part of a I thought more the light off a little lower here, but in the, well, whatever works. This is part of a project that has this title of bridging the ecologies of cities and of the biosphere. And I'm working on it with Nathan Doughton, who is a biologist by training, which is always very, very helpful to have that kind of knowledge, and I think, in fact, essential. And the notion is, when you look at cities, they are enormously complex systems. They're multiscalar. They have ecologies. You know, can we begin to use those capacities to do a more complex, if you want, systemic type of bridging with the ecologies of the biosphere? Now here is sort of a first, if you want, I'm just putting a few slides on to be faster about my presentation. So again, these particular features that cities have, how can we really maximize their utilities? Right now, it seems to me that we're not. And it could have to do with the kind of economic system that we have, a market-driven logic, an increasingly narrow market-driven logic that doesn't help us. Now, if you think about just a few properties, if this is perfect, by the way, a few properties of cities, you know, they are a kind of socio-ecological system that has an expanding range of articulations with nature's ecologies. The problem is that they're negative. Question for me, and really this is a question, are there systemic properties in this event that now has negative valence that we could give positive valence? So I'm not talking about destroying everything, I'm also talking about how do we work with what we have. There is a system there is systematicity if you want. How can we change its valence? Now, the final point here, you know, how can we begin to use, and begin, very modest language, very modest hope, if you want, these articulations to produce positive outcomes. Now, another feature, of course, of cities is that they mobilize new kinds of socio-ecological systems. And here are a few descriptions. For me, again, the question here is, if they're capable, if these complex systems with fuzzy logic sort of feedback effects, which no central planner can control, if these systems, cities, are capable of mobilizing new kinds of socio-ecological conditions, how can we use that property? That is an interesting systemic property, if you want, that they can mobilize these possibilities. And here are just a few sort of negatives mostly. Now, the fact of scaling. The fact of scaling in cities is another one of these insufficiently addressed, recognized, captured, if you want, conditions. So on the one hand, and again, I'm looking at capability here, the capability of the city to instantiate in a very specific, a piece of jewelry, a transport system, whatever, bad emissions, something that actually is enormously complex, that can have a global scale. The metal of a bus contains within it a global geography of extraction. If you multiply that, so the capacity of the city, almost like an entropic capacity, you know, like a black hole, it brings it in, and it combines elements from multiple parts of the world. Again, how can we recover that systematicity or those capacities and then give them positive valence? Same thing, and I'm just using these as examples. This is not a full list of all these things. But think of CO2 emissions. So if it's just a car in the countryside, it produces the emissions, but there is no scalar effect. Multiply that by all the cars in a city, and you actually get all kinds of scalar effects, you know, ozone holes, green gases, etc. So what we can, that final sentence there, effects that go beyond CO2 emissions per se. So it's already something different. That is making. That is a making that happens through a multi-scalar dynamic. And you can, again, multiply that by endless instances in the case of a city. How do we capture that capacity to make, but then, of course, change its valence? Now, here's another aspect. Again, these are all sort of little inquiries for me. Here's another aspect that I actually find extraordinary. And it has to do with systems in cities. Transport systems are a good example, but it could be fully air-conditioned office buildings that are capable of transmitting something, microbes, diseases, all bad things, at least at one scale they're bad. At a higher scale they might not be so bad, but at one scale. Without those systems being affected by them, that is an interesting problematic. So how can we recover that enormous capacity for transmitting something without having to become part of the something? If you want two levels of activity. Again, when you begin to think about a lot of the systems in cities along those lines, you are opening up windows, if you want, onto all types of possibilities. It's like a game almost of recoding some of the capacities that we see in cities. Now, one way of thinking about it, a kind of summarizing image, if you want, is this notion of reorienting the material and organizational ecologies of cities. So what I just said about a transport system or machines in a factory being able to transmit a disease without being affected by them is a kind of material ecology. And then there are, of course, all kinds of organizational ecologies. Now, I think we need to, this is my moment of hope here, to use and build upon those features of cities that can reorient these ecologies towards positive interactions. The second point here, these interactions and the diversity of domains they cover are themselves an emergent socio-ecological system that is bridging with the ecologies of the biosphere. So in there lies quite a bit, I would say, of potential. Now, one strategy that Nathan Doter and I are using in our research on this is this notion of, this is my language, and people sometimes think, I say delegating back to nature, and they think that because I have a foreign accent that I may be misusing English. But I must say, I really mean it that way. Delegating back to nature. Mind you, I use that language also. I don't use mimicking the biosphere, because I do think that cities are not biological systems. I think they are a different type of system, but it has multiple interactions with the biosphere. So one little example that I love, but there are many, we are creating a long list of all of these, is this bacteria, and it's both in the laboratory, but it also already has applications. I assume that some of the architects in the audience know about it, which is a bacteria that actually likes being in concrete and produces a calcium that seals the building. and has a double effect. It stops emissions, though I can't help but think, so what happens with all the bad gases inside these concrete buildings? But that's another question. That's like a little footnote. But it also, under certain conditions, has been found to actively purify the air, not at a very large scale, but sort of immediate air around a building or a sidewalk that has this. Now, this is just one example. There are many examples where we could actually use the capabilities of the biosphere, but that would take a lot of knowledge, and that is why it is not only urban. We can't leave this stuff only to urbanists and architects, so to speak. You know, we really do need to bring other forms of knowledge into the picture. Now, I wanted to come back to this notion that that cities are not biological systems. I have been involved sort of in a weak way, but involved with the Santa Fe Institute, you know, which is full of physicists, and I always say full of physicists who don't do physics. They do everything else, but not physics, which makes them actually absolutely fascinating. Now, one of the projects of the director, Geoff West, who is a physicist, is precisely to use, I find that for physicists, biology is often a bridge into some other object of study. So I have had two encounters with him. One, when we spoke both, you know, to his board of whatever, trustees, and so he was showing at that point, this was maybe 2 years ago, how in biology, of course, you have this incredible multiscalar repetition. You know, the orders of magnitude are they repeat. So from the amoeba up to whatever, the blue whale, the biggest organism. And then he was showing how with cities, it also goes. Now, this was based on an enormous amount of data gathering, vast amounts of. Some of the data that we as urbanists are rather suspicious of, but you know, there's a lot of data on cities, frankly. So he shows, so there is a thing, and then he said, but there's something that happens when the cities become very large, but he hadn't gotten there yet. And so I just saw him now at another meeting where we were together, and he had gotten there. And then what he shows with mathematical formulas, etc., is that after a certain size, the city does not respond to the laws of biology. Hence, something else happens. You know, we can call it fuzzy logic systems, we can call it something else. Now, I think that is very important data, that at different sizes of cities, some possibilities can happen. And at a large city, the notion that we can mimic the biosphere in order to address our problems is just really not a possibility. Now, another subject, of course, that is big on the agenda is ecological economics, which compared, I would say, to mainstream economics, I don't mean to offend any economist in the audience here, is an advance. It basically prices eco-services. I think I have another one here. No, this is when it goes sort of, when it quantifies. I think that is very interesting. I think that is a good way of shaking people up. We're actually using nature's services. I don't necessarily see it as a solution, but again, this is a debate. So it is important to recode. A lot of what we take from nature is beginning to happen with water, you know, that we're beginning to price it, etc. But I don't see it as really as the solution, or certainly not the only solution, to the sort of the catastrophic challenges that we face in the biosphere. And here I just want to wrap it up. This is my last slide here. What are some of the features, this repeats some of what I already said, what are some of the features of cities that could help us regarding this environmental issue? So the first one, these issues of, you know, economies of scale, density, and the efficiencies. This is a familiar subject. This, I would say, is the proposition that right now dominates a lot of the discussion about how cities can help the environmental project. And the key feature there is density, the density of cities and all that it entails. The second one, of course, is dense networks of communications. The fact that this means that things can circulate, I added to that when I talked earlier about the buses or whatever, other systems. There are multiple systems that are systems of circulation. Some of these are recognizable as systems of communication, others are not being used as such, though the spread of diseases signals that they are systems of communication of a sort. Now finally, this is something that has gone, I would say, a bit beneath the radar screen, is this issue of the temporal dimension that is, if you want, embedded in questions of the biosphere. And I see it as a challenge to recover different temporalities in order to address also the sort of the eco-crises, if you want. Finally, pretty as all of this is, and the projects that it contains, cities are systems of power with laws. So this is something that repeats itself through history, just a rational discourse that shows us all the advantages and how we can do it and all of that is not going to be enough. It's going to take other forms of action as well. We have to change laws, we have to change systems of authority, we have to change preference. By me, I don't mean us, okay? This is not a call to action. But what I'm saying, and these are, for me, neither is it just simply a question of organizing politically. These are embedded issues. That is where the question of temporalities also comes into the picture. Some of these are going to take a long time. Others are going through a tipping point as we speak. The spread of urban farming, the fact that now in New York City you can get a permit to have your chicken. Now, I don't want to have a chicken in my apartment, but maybe if I lived with a garden, chicken, they're amazing. Do they actually lay an egg every day or something like that? I don't know how they do that, but I find that absolutely extraordinary. So some of these things are just going to evolve and run into tipping points. Other aspects it's going to take real hard work. And this conference really has a series of scholars, researchers, and activists who have addressed different elements. We are by no means covering everything, different elements of this picture. So I am going to stop here, to welcome you all again, and to invite our first speaker, Dr. Westing. I'm going to introduce him very briefly. For me, Dr. Westing actually appeared on my radar screen way, way back when. I was very interested in the toxicity associated with Agent Orange, with the whole Vietnam. Any one of us who was sort of fighting against the war in Vietnam got inevitably very drawn into these issues of the destructiveness. And then when I was in Central America, and the destructions there associated with some military products, let's say, that the United States was passing on. So when I discovered Westing's writings, it just made a lot of difference to my thinking, to my understanding, and also to what are the variety of issues. And it is for me really an enormous pleasure and an honor that he could be here with us, because I think he's one of the heroes, going back to the 1970s, informing us. Now, he has been a consultant on issues on environmental security to the United Nations Environmental Program, the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research, and other such national and international agencies. He's a former senior research fellow at the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, which is a great institute. He's also a member of the European Peace University and a former captain in the United States Marine Corps. And the focus of his talk is war and its consequences, both on environments, if you want, and people. Dr. Westing.
Thank you. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. I have a few comments before my introductory comments. One of which is that I'm delighted to be here at Columbia. I'm a graduate of Columbia, and this is the first time I've been back since I graduated.
That says a lot about Columbia.
No. So that's a pleasure for me. Secondly, I'm delighted to see a number of friends here, and also it's interesting that Professor Sassen mentioned her interest in me was kindled by the fact that I was working on the Vietnam War and the Agent Orange issue. And I see in the audience a Professor Barry Weisberg, who is somebody that I was involved with probably 40 years ago, long time ago, when we were all incensed about what was happening in Vietnam. He co-wrote and edited a volume called Ecocide in Indochina, and I have one of the chapters in that book. So our connection goes back to that period. Now, when I was asked to speak, this is the introduction to the introduction now.
That's how we do it.
When I was asked to speak, I of course said yes, and then immediately outpoured in my mind a lecture which ran somewhere between 49 and 51 minutes. And so I was chagrined to learn I only had 29 or 30 minutes. But for those of you who are interested in getting the full picture, I do have a paper that has the full 49 minutes, and if anybody wants to see a copy of that, just give me your email and I'll send it to you. And so also it not only expands on some of the issues, it provides some nuances, although my wife tells me one of my weak sweets is nuancetivity. So, what I want to talk about today is warfare and its impact on the environment and the effect of that impact on the people involved. And this issue gave me a certain quandary because the topic of this conference has two key words in it: cities and eco-crises. Now, I can deal with eco-crises, but it took me a long time to figure out how to get the word city into my talk. So I do manage. However, I don't talk about direct attacks on cities during wartime, as horrendous as those are. What I want to do, and also I should say, I think that to some extent this talk will form a bridge between a conference that Professor Sassen had here a year ago, which in fact dealt with cities and war. And so this, in a sense, I think provides somewhat of a bridge between last year's conference and this one. So let me begin by mentioning 4 major points, which I think are crucial to understanding what I'm talking about. These are uncomfortable, they're disquieting. The first one is that wars are by their actual essence deadly and destructive. This is what wars are all about. This is the specific intent of a war, is to be detrimental to the armed forces, to the people, and the land of one's opponent. So point 1 is that wars are meant to be destructive. 2, the second point is that wars, as far as we can tell, have continued unabated without break since the earliest history and prehistory of the human species. This is very simply a characteristic endeavor of our species. The question of war is part and parcel of our very existence as a species. Arthur Koestler some years ago had it wrapped up nicely. I'll just quote one sentence from a book of his from the 70s. Quote, "The most persistent sound which reverberates through man's history is the beating of war drums." To give you some that's the end of the quote. To give you some perspective, just think back to World War II and the time between World War II and now. There's never been a year since that period, this more than half a century, when there haven't been more or less than about 24 wars going on one place or another around the world. So that's point 2, that wars are just with us. Point 3, the third issue I want to say is that oddly enough, counterintuitively, warfare has not gotten more disruptive, more destructive of the land and people through the centuries. The efficiency with which war is conducted, at least by the major nations, certainly has improved and keeps improving. However, the actual level of damage and destruction is relatively constant, and I'll hope I can demonstrate that in a few moments. What does limit the impact of warfare on the enemy is basically 3 things. 1, the objectives of the entity that's fighting the war, the will of each of the 2 parties, and 3rd, the tenacity of the parties. In other words, the reluctance to capitulate. So it's a question not of how serious war can get, it's a question of how soon the other side quits. And the 4th point, the 4th major point I'd like to make is that the impact of war on the human population is serious, it's nasty, it's horrible, but it hasn't changed much, at least in recent decades, in terms of its magnitude. There's been a steady and ever-increasing number of displaced people as a result of one thing or another, and I'll come back to this later, but the component of those displaced people that result from warfare or almost warfare like persecution hasn't changed much, certainly not in modern times. What is driving the ever-increasing number of migrants, of refugees, of displaced persons is the fact that their resource base is shriveling up, is deteriorating, and so it's a combination of not being able to sustain their livelihoods where they are and of being attracted to places where they think their life can be better, either in terms of safety or in terms of economics. And here is my first mention of cities. Roughly half of all the displaced people in the world in recent years have ended up in urban areas, in cities. So, let me now discuss briefly environmental components of warfare, because after all, this is what I'm supposed to be talking about, the impact of wars. One can think of 2 levels of environmental impact, and some might say that the second level can be split into 2 parts. The first level of environmental impact of warfare, of armed conflict, is unintentional, or at least incidental, so that whenever there is a battlefield of some kind, the battlefield itself, the theater of operations, is disrupted. This is not necessarily the intent of the perpetrators. It's an incidental effect on the environment, and it's referred to in military jargon as collateral effects. And so that's category 1. The second category, which I think I'll split into 2 parts, the second category is intentional destruction of the environment for one reason or another. This intentional disruption can be an attack on farms, on fields, on forests, on pasture lands, on rangelands, on water system, on the hydrological infrastructure. And so this might very well be intentional, and I'll give you quite a few examples of that in a few moments. So we have unintentional or collateral and the intentional effects. And now let me mention sort of a subcategory of the intentional effects. And those are attacks on the environment in such a way that a modest amount of energy supplied ends up in causing a massive form of damage. This multiplier effect is referred to in formal jargon as the release of dangerous forces. For example, destroying a major dam might take one or two bombs and then sweep a huge area into oblivion. Or the attack on a chemical factory might be one small attack, and in turn the noxious fumes released might be phenomenal. Or one could attack a nuclear power station. Again, a modest input of energy releasing a major output of destructive energy. So those are the categories of military impact on the environment. Let me dwell a little bit now on the intentional effects to give you a feeling for what I'm actually talking about. And here I'll split them into effects on the land and effects on the hydrological infrastructure. And here I could go back clear through history. I could talk about the Israelites and the Persians and the Spartans and the Mongols and so on, and it wouldn't be very different from today, but I will restrict myself pretty much to recent centuries. Although here I'll make one exception. Genghis Khan in the 13th century was overrunning what's now Afghanistan, what might have then been Afghanistan too, for all I remember. And he was, Genghis Khan's forces were relentless in their scorched earth tactics in trying to subdue, actually successfully subduing Afghanistan at the time. The reason I mention that is you could hardly tell the difference between the outcome of what Genghis did and what the Russians did, the Soviets did, during their Afghan War of 1979 to 89. They also subdued area after area with scorched earth tactics which you could not, the recipients could not distinguish between whether it was Khan, Genghis Khan, or some Soviet colonel that was doing it. Let me go on with a few more attacks on the land. In the 30 Years' War, that was a nasty war in which the Protestants of Sweden and Germany tried to work over the Holy Roman Empire. And year after year, they used incredibly brutal scorched earth tactics throughout Central Europe. But then, even perhaps, this was of course in the 1600s, then I can jump ahead to the mid-1800s. At the same time we were busy with the Civil War in this country, there was an incredible civil war halfway around the world in China. There was a group called the Great Peace Movement, which was about the greatest misnomer of all times. The Great Peace Movement of China took 10 years to find out that they could not overthrow the Manchu dynasty. And the way the Manchus finally put down the Taiping is Chinese for great peace, the way they finally put them down is they basically destroyed everything in 3 provinces in the center of the rebellion. And so it took them 10 years to quiet down make the peace movement into a peaceful movement. This was in the, as I say, in the exactly the same time as our Civil War. There was this Chinese Civil War. Let me move away from land now to give you a few examples of water. And since this place is loaded with people from the Netherlands, Professor Sassen and Thies are both from the Netherlands. Let me give you my first example. And this is the time when the French were trying to take over Holland. We're trying to take over the Netherlands in the mid to late 1600s. What did the Dutch do? Well, they thought they could prevent the French from advancing into Holland by opening the dikes on large areas of land, and they produced what was called the Holland Water Line in 1670 or something like that. And that was wonderful. The French got stopped dead. Nobody could swim in those days. But they forgot one thing, and that was winter came along not so long after, and the water froze, and so the French moved on. This was despite the fact that the local peasants of the Netherlands at the time tried desperately to stop this from happening, but the Dutch defense forces ignored the pleas of the peasantry and did this anyway. And unfortunately, several months after all this land was flooded, the French went through anyway. Let me give you one more, which in my view is the most spectacular event in all human history of this sort. And this is when the Japanese were trying to take over China just before our World War II, in what's referred to as the Sino-Japanese War of 1937, which merged into World War II. Here, the Chinese, Chiang Kai-shek, decided that to prevent the Japanese from overrunning China, they dynamited the dams of the Yellow River, the dikes, the levees of the Yellow River. This caused incredible flooding. The flooding killed several thousand Japanese soldiers, stopped them dead along a major component of that attempt. As I say, several thousand Japanese soldiers drowned, several hundred Chinese drowned, several million Chinese were displaced, 3 full provinces were utterly destroyed. The river was finally put back together again, by the way, with U.S. money after World War II. And as far as I can tell, as of a few years ago, those provinces have still not recovered their pre-war affluence to the extent that it was. So this is probably the largest single, the most disastrous single human-caused incident in all human history, including the nuclear attacks and so on. I could mention World War II, where there was intentional rural flooding. The British ruthlessly attacked, or pleasantly, depending on which side you're on here, the Ruhr Valley, and destroyed huge numbers of bridges, mines. They filled up mines and so on with water and so on and so forth. The Germans, in turn, by the way, also did a lot of flooding in the Netherlands during that time. So that's enough in terms of examples of intentional flooding for the moment, let me go to a totally different subject for a second, and that is the explosive remnants of war. By that I mean the landmines, the cluster bomb units, and other leftover ordnance following battle. These are incredibly pernicious. They do whatever they're supposed to do during the time of the battle. Then they stay there for decades afterwards, and people keep bumping into these mines and cluster bombs that hadn't blown up when they were supposed to and get blown up at the time. Just take Poland from World War II, which was swept over once or twice or thrice in World War II. A dozen or more Poles are killed every year from World War II ordnance that they bump into by mistake, plowing or fixing a road or putting in a new culvert or something like that. And worldwide, the Red Cross keeps track, and there are several thousand fatalities from past wars from these remnants of war, landmines, and cluster bombs. So far I've given lots of examples, but I haven't mentioned the United States, and since we're all Americans here, or most of us, let me give you a quick history of our involvement in all of this. Let's start way back in 1600s when the Virginia colonists, year by year, maintained the upper hand with the hostile Native Americans by continually destroying crops around and about the Virginia colony. Jumping to the Revolution, George Washington, subsequent to the war, said that his most successful, best planned, and most wonderful action during the entire Revolution was not crossing the Delaware. It was destroying the crops of the Iroquois and their food supplies, which effectively ruled them out as important allies of the British. And as I say, this attack on the Iroquois farms and fields in upstate New York primarily and around and about, Washington thought was the most important thing he had done in the war. I won't dwell on the Civil War or the Indian Wars. When we subdued the friendly natives out west, we constantly attacked their means of survival. And then, of course, in the Civil War, Sherman's march, destruction of Georgia, Sheridan's destruction of Virginia and the Shenandoah Valley are well known. So the Civil War is a good example. In the Philippine War that we had right around 1899, 1903 in there, we were ruthless in attacking various provinces by destroying their farms and fields over entire provinces. And they were modeled after these March to the Sea by Sherman and so forth. And if some of you remember, maybe Mark Twain was incensed by that and wrote some very powerful essays and one beautiful poem called The War Prayer, which was an attack on our Philippine actions, our actions in the Philippines. World War II, we attacked German grain crops with incendiary attacks. The Korean War, we decided that the most successful attacks that we ever made in the Korean War, the official histories, were the attacks on the dams of North Korea, which destroyed their infrastructure, electrical system, power systems, and food, irrigation, and so on. And to get to the Vietnam War, this of course has become famous for its environmental attacks against forest and field. Here, the term that has gotten into the diplomatic language of widespread, long-lasting, and severe, that I'll come back to in a few moments, originated. But as you know, we attack forests relentlessly, we attack crops relentlessly, and this is one of the reasons why so many people throughout the world were aghast at our activities and actions and approaches in Vietnam, and that's what got me involved in all of this too. Agent Orange was mentioned. This is, of course, a legacy of the Vietnam War, which is still causing medical effects to Vietnamese, to Americans, and to others. Well, let me get now to refugees. I see that I'm running out of time, so I will make this very quick and say that I'll just give you a few simple facts that summarize what I want to say here. One is that numbers of displaced people or refugees around the world right now, or in 2009, according to official UN figures, is 255 million people who have left their homes because of one reason or another. Now, the one reason or another is important. One of the reasons is war. And of those 255, by the way, that's 4% of the global population. One of the components of why is about is the desire not to get shot. And so this is running away, fleeing from war, or to some extent from persecution. And that represents about 14 million people a year. So what does that leave from 255? About 230 million, which are not war involved. And these are the ones that one might refer to as environmental refugees. Just one more fact about, or two more facts about those numbers before I leave them. The 14 million, give or take a few million, are the ones that are running away, fleeing from war, half of them probably ending up in cities. And that number has not changed, at least since World War II. By changed, I mean it hasn't had an upward or a downward trend. It fluctuates slightly. So it might be 12 million, might be 16 million, but it keeps bouncing around 14 million. The other 230 million, not war-related, that's been going up in recent years by 8 million a year. So whatever the number was last year, it's 8 million more this year, and it's been happening that way for at least the last decade or so. So let's not give war a bad rap. It's something else. Thank you. Let me conclude now by saying, what can we do? Or what should we do? And there are three things I want to talk about as I finish this up, and that is, what about environmental disruptions as a result of war? They're not increasing, but they're nasty, and they shouldn't be there. As I say, they generate something like 15 million, 14 million people a year as displaced people, as refugees, as migrants, and so on. And here we have a number of treaties, the most exciting of which was in 1977, instigated by the International Committee of the Red Cross, and it's referred to as the Protocol on International Armed Conflicts. This one gives pretty severe restrictions restraints on attacking agricultural areas, dams, nuclear generating facilities, and so on. And even more interesting, and this is the first instance where something like this has gotten into the law of war, or what's now euphemistically referred to not as the law of war, but as international humanitarian law, is that it has made illegal actions that are expected to cause, not that have caused, but are expected to cause environmental effects that are widespread, long-lasting, and severe. And this was the worldwide reprimand to the U.S. after our Vietnam War. So there's another one on non-international wars, which in one sense is more important because there are more non-international or internal wars than there are international wars. On the other hand, that gets very touchy diplomatically, so that's a very weak treaty. So one should support them both. The United States is one of the few countries in the world that belongs to neither. All of our NATO allies belong to those two treaties. We're the only holdouts. Explosive Remnants, same story. Jody Williams of Putney, Vermont, where we're from, got the Nobel Prize a few years ago for being the force behind having the Landmine Treaty of 1997, the Landmine Convention, enacted, which forbids a party to even possess landmines. Very nice treaty. Every NATO country belongs except for the United States. There's a much more recent treaty on cluster munitions, which are also nasty, the so-called CBUs, cluster bomb units. That was only enacted in 2008, and things move with glacial speed or glacial slowness, so not very many countries belong to it yet, but at least half of the NATO countries do belong. All of the good, nice countries like Netherlands and Sweden and Norway and Denmark do belong. But again, the United States does not. France and Britain both do. So that's one thing. We should somehow or other try to get the diplomatic forces to prevent these things. In terms of refugees, all I can say is the real problem is not from warfare, but from the civil sector. And here, I think the real problem is overpopulation. I won't go into that any further. And finally, I'll just mention the term global warming, since this is on the horizon and everybody is worrying about it. And here again, whatever I have said will probably be exacerbated by the effects of global warming. And so here we really have to strive for a sustainable energy consumption future. So that's about it. Sure.
Thanks. Thank you very, very much. That was a great sort of landscape to work off and work with. Now I would like to call the first panel and introduce Rachel Armstrong, who will chair the panel. Rachel Armstrong is co-director of AVATAR, which means Advanced Virtual and Technological Architectural Research in Architecture and Synthetic Biology at the Bartlett School of Architecture, which is a University College of London. She's also a senior TED Fellow and visiting researcher at the Center for Fundamental Living Technology, which is a Department of Physics and Chemistry at the University of Southern Denmark. Her research investigates a new approach to building materials called living architecture that suggests it is possible for our buildings to share some of the properties of living systems. So Rachel, if you come, and the three first panelists. Rachel will also speak this afternoon in one of the panels. I think we could have some lights maybe. And she will introduce you, Tis. You can just...
Right, good morning, everybody. I'm glad you all made it despite the rain. Somehow or other, rain is always a surprise. No matter what city you live in, no matter what city you visit, it always seems somewhat of a shock to architecture that actually the world has a variable climate and that buildings are not perpetually designed to be dry. So as I was picking my way through the perpetual torrent of puddles, I was struck by three things. One, someone needed to tell New York road engineers about the invention of drains. Secondly, that we were totally wasting a really valuable resource and just tipping it away into wherever. And thirdly, that we really do need to have a more sensible relationship with the environment. And so it's a great pleasure to me to be able to welcome our distinguished panel today. And even if they can't stop the rain, maybe they'll be able to advise us on having a much better integrated relationship between architecture and the environment. So if I just called the speakers up in order and just give a brief bio, you've all got more further details in your handouts there. There's speaker biographies, but I'll just summarize just so you know who's speaking and roughly what they're going to be talking about. So the first speaker, and they're all going to speak for 20 minutes. This first speaker is Thijs Rijcken, who works at the Delft University and is looking on integrated water infrastructure development. And as a design engineer, he's commercialized a balancing product for floating houses and took it to market, and also has registered a patent on a modular floating foundation concept. He's an award-winning writer, and he's currently developing a project for protection of the Nile Delta for the 21st century. So, and he's going to talk to you about cities and floods, living on a water machine. So, thank you, Thijs. Thank you.
Did you say Nile Delta?
Yes, I did.
There we go. Where is the mouse? I'm from Holland. As you can see, it's the center of the world. I like Google very much. They're very sensitive people. Before I begin, Arthur, your point is already in my pocket with the vulnerability of the Dike system. I'm aware of it, but I wouldn't really be able to say what our current attitude towards it is. So I'm definitely going to check that out. It's a very interesting point. Holland is at the end of the River Rhine, and it's a delta, and in a natural delta, you cannot live because the borders between land and water are changing all the time, and that's very unpractical. So Holland has turned that delta into a big water machine and benefited greatly from that machine as a trading hub and fertile soil use for agriculture. However, the machine is sinking down, and that also shouldn't be too much of a problem. But the system, the water machine, does deserve continuous attention and modifications because of climate change, but also because of other changes in society, and that's what I will be talking about. Let's go to the next slide. There we go. I'm on a great trip. I'm on a great adventure. It started 2 years ago when influential Delta Commission consulted the Dutch government on flood policy for the next century. The result of that committee was that in 10 years from now, the government will put aside 1 billion euros for spendings on water infrastructure, flood defense. And that looks like a long time ahead, 10 years, but it's in fact sort of normal in infrastructure planning that you think in those time spans. In that report was this drawing, and it's a drawing that I made with a plan to protect the Rhine Delta from flooding. And the Rhine Delta is for an engineer an interesting region because it is the flood protection system protects about 8 million people, about 4 million in this particular region, but the Dike ring spreads out northbound, and it has to deal with storm surges and high river discharges, and for a particular region there, the coincidence of both those events. And that is what this plan addresses. And the adventure that I'm at is that the plan is still standing, and after that report, it was sort of, I got a nice amount of research money to investigate it further. And how do you investigate such an issue? I'm an engineer, by the way, although I like policy and general perspectives on engineering. What we did in our research is see the system as a hydraulic, spatial, connected system that can be modified by various different interventions, here drawn in red and purple. Each intervention combined with a climate and economic scenario, with a climate scenario, leads to so-called hydraulic loads. You don't have to remember all this, but this is just a general idea, like how one protects a river delta. So it's not as simple as the sea level rises 0.5 meter, so all the design water levels also rise 0.5 meter. It's more complicated than that. This is just one alternative and just one climate scenario that we're looking at here. Next step is what do the rising water levels mean for the dikes that protect what we call inner dike regions from river water and sea level rise. Some dikes are historically higher than others for all kinds of reasons. That's step 2. Step 3 is there is something like the outer dike regions in Holland, and that is the region between the dike and the river. And I was in England the other day, and people said, like, what is that outer dike region that you keep talking about? And I said, it's a barren wasteland. The very air you breathe is a poisonous fume. No, it's most of the stuff that's going on there is port activity and regenerated ports into other other functions such as housing. And of course, there's a lot of nature and agriculture going on. And the question is, how does climate change affect these outer dike regions? Important part of the equation. Then there's shipping. Shipping is not really affected by climate change, at least high water levels. Low water levels are an issue too, but that's not what I'm talking about now. But different solutions that we can take to keep our flood risk low can affect shipping. So shipping is another important part of the equation. Then there are ecological flows. I don't have a map about that, but that's also important. And this is a plan for the sort of short term. So that first drawing that you saw would be a solution for 2100. And what I'm now very interested in, like what's going to be the next step that we can take, and that's in fact a barrier and a combination of dike reinforcements. Those are huge projects, so it's very exciting to work on that. Am I addressing an eco-crisis here, I was asking myself. What could an eco-crisis be? I came to a very simple approach. Either it's nature putting a crisis to humans, or humans could be putting crises on ecology. And in water infrastructure development in Holland, both of these eco-crises are at stake. And then there's the same as Arthur, like, what about the cities? Well, fortunately, sort of Holland is one big park city. Let me just sit back and relax. Let me just show you some pictures of Holland. This is one of the things that I enjoy. I go out in the country and I take pictures. And Holland is associated with rain, however. In fact, it rains only 7% of the time. Isn't that interesting? But water is indeed everywhere. This is when Holland is happy. Not when the French came in, of course, but it's so great. You should be in Holland when there's ice. Everybody's happy. Everybody's making jokes and talking to each other. It's great. Unfortunately, because of climate change, we have less ice. Here we are starting to see the dikes. This is a very modest little dikey. Here is a dike a little bit bigger. This is a lake protecting the inner dike from storm surges at a lake. And here we have a serious dike, serious sea dike. Talking about serious dikes, what's our attitude towards eco-crisis number 1? Increasing flood risk. One important thing is that we have a law in the Netherlands dictating a certain level of protection. And the funny thing about that law is that actually climate change is embedded in that law. When climate change occurs, and every 5 years that law is being like there's a sort of a test going on whether the system is updated according to the law or not. And when climate would change, more and more parts of the system would be disqualified, and according to the law, there has to be money allocated to combat that. It's not as simple as that, because even though a law dictates that resources should go somewhere, there are more laws like that, and there's a limited national budget. That's one thing. Another thing is that some parts of that law are actually outdated, or and a third issue is that even when the law says a dike is no longer high enough or strong enough, there are more ways to deal with that. So the law looks simple, but it's actually, it has some complicated issues. That's the current situation. We have that law. Then on the long run, there's that Delta Committee that I just referred to that has come up with a long-range plan for projects on Dutch water infrastructure. Eco-crisis number 1, reducing flood risk. Eco-crisis number 2, engineering works in the past that have actually destroyed a lot of ecosystems in the Netherlands, particularly the so-called famous delta works in the southwestern delta. What's nice about a estuarine ecological system are 3 things. First, biologically it's very productive. There are a lot of nutrients coming in, a lot of energy, tidal energy coming in, so the production of biomass is very large. Second, because there's a salt-freshwater gradient, that attracts ecosystems and animals that particularly like this very special salt percentage, and the biodiversity therefore is large. And the third one, of course, is fish migration. So if there's a dam, the fish cannot migrate up the river and spawn. What I find very interesting is that the World Wildlife Fund is lobbying pretty strongly to reopen the dams in the southwestern delta, which would have huge consequences. So we are working on eco-crisis number 2. I'll get back to that a little later in this presentation. What I want to address also, because the easy thinking about Holland is like, Holland is drowning because of climate change, what are we going to do about it? First, it's more complicated than that, and then there's ecology, and then there are more driving forces behind modifications to the water infrastructure system. So you know that, of course, but it's not as simple as the dikes have to be raised because of climate change. It's much more complicated. Why I like the comparison between driving forces behind modification to the water system and the Maslow pyramid is that also in the public sector, in the water infrastructure development, there's more interest in higher functions in the Maslow pyramid, such as spatial quality, living with water, and ecology or recreation. It's debatable whether you think that is high up in the Maslow hierarchy or not, but let's talk about that some other time. So we got this sort of complex but yet limited set of driving forces behind the water system. What are the issues? What I find challenging is how much money can we put in goals that are in the top of the Maslow pyramid? I mean, in our daily lives, we spend a lot of money on luxury and identity and that kind of thing. So why not in the public sector as well? Issue number 2, how safe is safe enough? Issue number 3, how to isolate the climate change factor. I think Shiv I read your article, that's also a little bit what you talked about, like how do you relate climate change to all the other factors in related projects. So those are about the objectives, and then there's the goal. Then there are the solutions, and the solutions vary in the amount of engineering that they propose. And fear of engineering, that's what we talked about in our email correspondence, Saskia, is a very important and interesting issue. Even you referred to that today with the engineering that is going on in New York too. Well, I'll get back to that later. Hold on. Yeah, that's not going on. Yeah, exactly. So we have a very funny relationship to engineering. When it works, we don't notice it, and when it doesn't work, we complain. How to justify or sell investment in the top of the Maslow pyramid? I'm going to skip this one because I thought I had a half an hour for some silly reason. In the program, I didn't get it. This is a difficult issue. What's going on here? Here we got the Southwestern Delta again. The essence is what I'm thinking is we have to keep pushing and keep debating about, are we willing to spend money to improve ecology? Like that's, like as a designer engineer, I want to know like what's my budget to work on that, and that's not clear. People are hiding it in other objectives, and that's issue number one. Issue number two: how safe is safe enough? The uncertainty in climate change makes it very hard to say this is the level of safety that we want because we don't really know what the threat is exactly. And there are other issues also that make it very difficult to set a hard point of this is our safety level. Theoretically, the safety level is an optimum between the risk reduction and the investment to make to reduce the risk. The more precious the treasure, the more expensive the case around the treasure. And that should be in balance with each other. But there are many reasons why that is actually an illusion that you can calculate it very strictly. So what I sometimes think is maybe we shouldn't we shouldn't keep calculating so much about trying to get that objective standard, but we should just think in relative steps. Like, we don't know exactly how safe we want to get, but at least this measure will make us a lot safer. Everybody gets that. Then there's the issue of to isolate the climate change factor. Why would you want that? Well, personally, what bothers me sometimes is that climate change as a driver for investments gets a lot of attention, but maybe there are many other reasons why you would want to invest also. For example, an African country could say we want an irrigation system because of climate change, but mostly they want the irrigation system because they need that to grow crops. So, you know, to keep reasonings sharp and clear, let's try to isolate that factor. Now, here's going to be a little bit of math for you. Risk is probability times impact. And if the sea level rises 60 centimeters, basically in Holland that means that the probability increases tenfold. If economy would grow the coming 90 years at 2% a year, and flood impact it would be related to economic growth, that would mean impact rises 6 times. So in a sense, you could say, well, climate change is pretty important for Holland. However, in an economy that grows 5% a year, in 90 years, the flood impact would increase 80-fold. So for China, if you think in terms of flood risk and you want to reduce that, climate change is not even that big a factor. Economic growth is the biggest factor that increases the risk. So it's important to think in, I'm interested as an engineer to think in those terms. However, in Holland, since our design standards were put in 1960, the potential damage will grow 30 times, about that. Multiplied by the probability growth of 10, factor 10, that's a risk increase of 300. So that does call for measures. I mean, if a risk increases 300-fold in a current environment, economic environment, that calls for action. How does that work? The risk is that there's a storm at sea, river water coming in, dike fails, flood. How does a waterfront look like? We have the dike, and then we have that barren wasteland with the poisonous fume and the outer dike. In an urbanized area, dikes do not look like this. You see, dikes are urbanized also. So houses are built on the dike. That makes it a lot harder to raise the dike. Now, how it works in Holland is there's a probability distribution. You also mentioned that in your paper that I found very relevant. People don't really think in probability distributions. And the law says we have a 1 in 1,000, we accept a 1 in 1,000 or 1 in 10,000 probability of a water level. And that dictates the height of a dike. Now, if the law gets stricter because the impact of a flood increases, that would mean that the dike would have to be raised. If climate changes, but the law doesn't change, still the dike should be raised because of the whole water level rises, you see? And what's going to happen is both. So would that mean that the dike would have to be raised, which is a pain in the bum in urbanized areas? Now that's where that plan that I came up with, what that addresses, like between those barriers is the urbanized region. So the idea is there you don't have to raise the dikes. You might even, the dike height might even, go down if necessary. We wouldn't do that, but theoretically. So, we moved from objectives for modifications in water infrastructure to solutions to address that. My suggestion is engineering these things. Oh, these things. These are like hundreds of millions, so not billion euro projects. Do we trust engineering? Probabilistic engineer says, no, don't trust engineering. There's a failure of probability. So probably the designer of the New York sewer system is saying, of course it's flooding. We knew that. We accepted a probability of flooding because if we would have made the system larger, then the amount of time, the probability of flooding would go lower, but it would cost you more tax money. And then you would complain too. So we have reached an optimum. Now, this is what an engineer would say. And he says, oh yeah, you can reduce the probability of failure. We have to research it more carefully because we narrow the bandwidth of uncertainty, and we can improve it technologically. And the optimal probability of failure is the outcome of a cost-benefit analysis between the risk-reducing investment and the risk reduction. That's what I just said too. And fear is not in the question. It's just the failure probability. That's what we want to know. That's what we count with. That's what an engineer would say, a probabilistic engineer would say. However, we built then this thing in Holland that changed that debate a little bit. This thing has cost, together with another one that's sort of a little bit smaller, about 1 billion euros. And its size is larger than the Eiffel Tower, so we have 2 Eiffel Towers floating there. And the original supposed probability of failure was 1 in 1,000, and it appeared to be 1 in 100, and that had major consequences. That changed the perspective on faith in engineers. Now let me cut this. I don't have a clock. Am I like talking for half an hour yet, or I'm only 15 minutes? 20 minutes. Okay. Now, these could also be those barriers to students of mine. And they're a little bit more sensitive than that Maasland barrier that I just showed you. I'm going to jump a little bit now to my conclusion, and I have a small video that I want to show you. I don't know what you got and what you didn't get, but the essence of the Dutch flood protection is that it revolves around a very mathematical core. The whole thinking in terms of finding an optimum in flood protection, and it's quite extensive, and it's really about probabilistic engineering. And I think the age of rational planning is behind us. However, when it comes to flood protection, that's still the core around which everything revolves, and also the funding allocations. But what's happening is that there are all these non-modern, like a mathematical policy is, I would call that modernistic, right? Modernism. And so there's a lot of postmodern reflexive. I mean, I'm not a sociologist, but revolving around that core, and we have to integrate that nicely, like ecological objectives, non-quantifiable, luxury, country branding, fear, distrust, and lack of understanding of failable technology. Those are not embedded in that modernistic core. How about political ad hocness? Politics is always ad hoc, you'd say, but I just like the word ad hocness. I think it's funny. So what are you talking about? Of course, this is happening, like the whole issue of modernism and postmodernism. But what I'm trying to do is to make it more explicit, and even to model it and measure it. And here is my attempt. So I'm working on this series game, and the series game integrates a hydraulic model with a policy model. So you don't only model the physics and the costs and the benefits, but also the way the stakeholders choose and relate to those options. It's a bit like SimCity. So the game shows you the weak spots as they pop up when sea level rises. So the sea level rises, and the dikes are not all like exactly right. So there are some weaker spots and better spots, and poof, poof, poof. Before you play it, you choose your scenarios. Because when you would ask me what the way to go is in Holland, is that people who are involved, they have to start to understand the system, also the non-engineers. And then, with that collaborative understanding, we have to choose the next step. And then, and then in 20 or 30 years, there will be other people who will determine the next step. And so the game serves to help understand. And I've been in stakeholder participation sessions, and what I discovered is that it's great to have the stakeholders to debate, but it would be so much better if they would have more knowledge. So that's what this game would address. They get a budget every 5 years or 10 years, and they can build with it. And they, for example, recognize that, hey, you can't build everything you want. If you want ecological improvement in the southwestern delta, where do you get the money from? So you get, and then, and I got some money to elaborate further on this. So it's going to be very exciting. Because I want interactive elements too, that people who use it, they can send if they disagree with something, if they know if they have a better idea, if we lack some kind of report, and you can download reports. So here, this is a very important screen. To really tap into the pool of knowledge and ideas and values of everybody involved. Do you get the sort of vision that I have about combining that modernistic and postmodernistic elements? Yeah, we can sort of wrap up. Here you see how storm surges and river discharges correlate with each other. And that gives you the probability of those hydraulic combinations to get people some understanding of the whole nature of probability. It's very hard to get your head around what probabilities and chances really are. Now, continue game, quit without sending, quit and send your data. And the ideal is that enough people play it so we can match patterns of preferences with the profile of the players. And then we have the unity between sociology and engineering. Saskia. Thank you very much.
Thank you. The next speaker, I'm actually opting for the save and continue later budget button. But next speaker is Shiv Someshwar, who's an expert on climate change and adaptation and development policy. He directs the Asia and Pacific Regional Programme of the International Research Institute for Climate and Society, and also the Adaptation Programme of the Earth Institute's Global Network for Climate Solutions, and has helped develop Columbia's programme on climate and society. And now he's going to talk to us about adapting to climate risks, comparing approaches. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Saskia. Thank you, the organizers, for getting me here. Following the brilliant presentation with extremely kind of catchy visuals, I'll have to plead that I have none of that. This is going to be a little bit more of a dry hum-ho of a presentation, so you'll have to bear with me, and you may really need to focus. So now what I'm going to do is just walk you through the challenges that are involved in what we call a kind of adaptation to climate change. And before I do that, because many times in my talks, it does come across as possibly that because of the nuances that I demand, that it may come across that I'm more of a skeptic. So this the first 3 slides is to show, no, climate change is real, and we are in it for whether we like it or not. So that's to kind of put all of you at ease. Then the next set of slides would be really to kind of, since I had very little idea of the nature of participants here, so I didn't want to take it for granted that you guys are already all top-notch on all aspects of weather, climate, and so on. So this is just a kind of a very simple, quick run-through. And if you guys have already done that, you can just say, I love participation. So you can just say next, 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 and we kind of go along. So the core is to just focus on 2 case studies, Mumbai and Manila, and to basically kind of draw out some of the issues that are, some of the challenges of having city planning agencies, the key agencies as well as civil society groups. How do you, in a practical way, begin to address the challenges of climate risk, both of variability and change? So now we'll just go through the first set of slides. Oh, it's right here, sorry. I think I took that from you because you kept looking up there. So now I need to, there you go. Oh, this one. Okay, famous picture. This is COP, Conference of Parties in Bali, which is because of the UNFCCC. Every year the different countries meet. That's a famous picture of the Nobel Peace Prize of Al Gore and Dr. Pachauri for the Ipcc. So well-deserved, based on this whole lot of work that has been done by thousands of scientists that comes under the heading of the Ipcc, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. They have 3 working groups on climate impacts and kind of policy, what can be done on mitigation especially. And this is to unequivocally kind of tell you that, well, temperatures are going to be increasing over the next 100 years, and also there's going to be serious fluctuations in precip. And this slide and this one is not very clear because they didn't want you guys to squint and get a headache. So the idea is just kind of chill out, saying, okay, science is there, science tells us it's happening, and now we move on. Okay? So if there are any kind of skeptics, I would love to debate, but maybe later on after coffee. So for those of you who may have heard of climate change and wonder, how is it related to weather? Because increasingly the media portrays, anytime you have a big storm, you have a big kind of thunder shower, there is always one part of the media saying, oh, this is climate change. And it's neither completely wrong nor completely right. Okay, so what we have are these 3 distinct systems. You have the weather, you have climate variability, and climate change. The weather is in the realm of 1 to 10 days, and it's basically because of atmospheric and land interactions. And science has progressed well enough that we have really good skill in predicting weather in most parts of the world. Climate variability is all the way from 2 to 3 months through natural variability goes on through multi-decades, through decades. And that is an important component, is you bring in the influence of oceans that give persistence and hence give skill, helps give model skill. Okay, so and then you have climate change, which is generally several decades out into a century or more. And there you have not only the kind of a fine-grained understanding of the physical processes that are at play on these timescales, but most importantly, they're also driven by socioeconomic assumptions that go into, especially those that govern emission scenarios. Okay, so it's important to keep in mind that when we talk about weather, climate variability, climate change, there are distinct patterns of influence, and there are kind of differential kind of model skills that are possible for, and again, there is high spatial variability in this kind of modeling. Climate variability and climate change are related. This may surprise some in the media, but they are related, that you have high seasonal interannual fluctuations over the long term is what constitutes climate change. And if you have a linear trend like they have, just have here in this caricature, even with no fluctuations, no increase in fluctuations of variability, you will still have new record highs. That's because the base is changing. So given the last 150 years, we have kind of effectively ruined and continue to ruin the atmosphere, pumping in all varieties of greenhouse gases. What we are having now is increasingly in the coming decades, you're going to have more and more of the anthropogenic influence impacting the natural variability. So that's why when you ask a scientist, okay, is climate change here? They always sidestep the issue, because yes, in some sense it is, but in some sense, you know exactly what, when a person says climate change is here, they're really looking for this kind of large anthropogenic influence. So you shouldn't put scientists in that tough spot, but maybe you should. That will kind of sharpen their minds. So what we have is an understanding of variability and change is really important. And of course, now we recognize that there's going to be new highs, both kind of return periods of droughts and precip. So what we have is another important set of issues that would be good to get your minds around is the Ipcc models. There are 21, 22, 23, depending on how you count them. These are projections, okay? They are not predictions, and this is not to somehow kind of downplay their importance. They are not predictions because they're not initialized with current climate conditions. So so this is important to realize that when you have these kind of model runs, they're really projections, because what science was trying to get at is through the emissions, what is going to happen, the what ifs because of emission scenarios. But it's really good news is in the next round, which the reports will be out beginning in 2013, called the assessment report, the 5th series of assessment report of the Ipcc, they're actually going to have predictions as well, decadal predictions. And this is hugely important, especially for policymakers. Okay, so Ipcc models have really good agreement on temperature increases. More or less all of them agree on the nature of temperature increases. And effects on precip, that is both snowfall and rain, is more uncertain. You have some models that seem to suggest more than others. And of course, depending on the region that you are focusing on, this conference, and then my take is spatiality, space-based. So depending on the region you are interested in, there are some model disagreements. Okay, but this is not in any way to kind of doubt that climate change is real. This is a quick note for those of you who have perused climate change literature. You'll always have, it's not just the physicality of science, but underlying that, many people miss out are the scenarios, the socioeconomic scenarios that underlie what the what ifs coming over the next century. You have the more integrated, happy world. All of us will be kind of dancing with joy. A more divided world. Everyone declares war on everyone else, and so on. And each one of them have a very different emission scenarios. Emission is greenhouse gas that are likely to be put out. So now, coming to the question of cities. Cities and climate change, there are some specific challenges that we need to confront. One is climate change is due to dispersed emission sources. It's not due to any one. It's due to thousands of dispersed emission sources. And you have kind of complex interactions with socioeconomic. It's not just one sector or a couple of sectors. It is across all of our all the sectors that we depend on, and especially the developing countries that are looking to the West to say, okay, that's the model of development. It's very much kind of integrated with what we want to be based on what we have been. So it challenges at a very core notion of what it means to develop. And the impacts vary over space and time. In Rotterdam, it would be very different from, say, the Nile Delta. And it's completely different from Jakarta in the same year, even taking into account the seasonality. So what we have is it's really difficult to motivate policymakers that are place-based, time-based, to take local action on kind of globally averaged climate change. So what we really need to have is a much better sense of, okay, how is weather and climate changing over kind of quote-unquote my part of the world? say, metropolitan New York. Okay? And then you have to deal with some of the uncertainties that were referred to earlier. So it's very clear in the IPCC reports itself that especially when it comes to urban areas and cities, the impact of climate change in the coming decades is going to be less than some of the impacts due to the dynamism of the cities themselves. And you'll see in my case studies how this kind of comes across. It's not just somehow that if we did not have climate change, there would be development nirvana, that there was sustainable development everywhere and there was high equity. It is that the climate change is an additional driver, and it's a very important, critical driver of development risk. In addition to war, trade, I hate you or you hate me, all of these different things that surrounds us, this is an additional driver. So it's not somehow to suggest, it's neither to take away the importance of climate change, nor is it to suggest that, oh, you take care of climate and everything else is okay. So that's why I'm a tad allergic to, especially the Asian Development Bank always says climate proofing cities. There is no such thing as climate proofing cities, because it suggests that once you climate proof, then you can forget about climate. Maybe it did happen in Arthur C. Clarke's or Asimov's, where you have a big kind of bubble and everyone kind of is under that. But most of us have to manage risks. So it is really the risk management that is really critical. And that was no dig at you. I did see climate proof down there, but that was really for the Asian Development Bank. So what we have is cities have two kinds of responses, mitigation and adaptation. And today I'm going to focus on adaptation. There are experts at the Earth Institute who do both, mitigation experts as well as adaptation. Right now I'm just going to focus on adaptation, which is kind of managing to bring in resilience to cities. And this is now emerging as a new priority internationally, because the focus was all on mitigation. How do you bring down these greenhouse gas emissions? And even now, despite a focus on adaptation, the funding levels of adaptation, globally speaking, are very low, an order of magnitude lower. And these are the pledges. I mean, by the time the pledges actually turn to real dollars, you lose another 100th. So adaptation has ways to go in actually getting the resources, and as you will see, getting the focus both of science and policymakers. The stakeholders for local adaptation are the agencies that provide basic services, households, communities, and what I call them as the partial because there's always kind of voice amplifiers, such as self-styled community organizations, NGOs, and there are a whole slew of NGOs, gongos, bingos, nongos. There are a whole bunch of them, depending on who funds them. And then you have, of course, elected officials. And each one of them kind of are always, all of us are for, who cannot be for citizens. So, but all of us have a partial interpretation of what citizen really wants or needs or should have, in fact. So those are the stakeholders. And you have the motivation is to protect cities as well as livelihoods. It's not the physicality of the cities that only we're concerned about. It's the economic system, the livelihood system, both in the now and in the future. That is, in the future, out to 100 years, which has been the hallmark of climate change discussions. But for policymakers, it's really in the now, next week, next season, possibly next year, a couple of decades out. So there are kind of very, very specific kind of location-specific challenges to how much we know what we can do. One is the temporal and spatial climate downscaling itself. Globally, there is a pretty good skill on climate change scale, but when you try to downscale it, there are some real issues. And so scientists are working on it, and this is an area where climate skeptics would have you believe that, oh, we need to wait until better knowledge comes along. That would be completely the wrong approach. You need to work with what you have, and I'll show you the way we do work at the Earth Institute on this. And so a key emphasis is the understanding of current climate variability. The wiggly lines you saw, you have for the last 100 years data, that can actually give you a pretty good handle on what is likely to happen 30 years out. And then you have to deal with the sources of uncertainty. This is not only of uncertainty of climate, but also of socioeconomic trends. If you only step back and think about how 100 years ago New York was, could you have imagined a planner actually projecting the needs, the demands for public services kind of in the city? And here I think they did a pretty good job. But in most parts of the world, you have planning always is an ex post affair. Planning catches up with reality. Planners go out and say, oh, this is no longer a green space, then I better go back and change it. Then it becomes, I don't know, semi-urban space. So you have a very different approach to planning. And this is further heightened by issues of vulnerability. Vulnerability is not just because of climate, but it is because of who you are. That is, where do you live in the city? If you are a slum dweller living in a shanty town, you have a much higher probability of being flooded than a person who lives on the 17th floor in a modern block of apartments, which has all the kind of kind of flood proofing that has been the finest engineering can buy. So then you have the where and the when also is dictated by who you are, what you do, what are your kind of spatial pathways within the city. So it is not somehow that city as a monolithic unit can be climate proofed. So we have two contrasting kind of urban cases. One is Mumbai flood management, Bombay, now called Mumbai, and metropolitan Manila. And the key lessons that we kind of draw out are that currently institutions that manage climate risk, both in the weather, seasonal and interannual and longer timescales, are extremely reactive. And what you need to have is the opposite, is anticipatory risk management. That is what is needed. And so there is a lot of emphasis in climate discussions about the need to have better forecasts. And this is very true, because with better forecasts, better skill, you can do a lot. But forecasts alone are insufficient. You really need to understand how institutions work, what are the incentives, who are the stakeholders, and all of that is an extremely kind of, it's not an easy set of processes to model. So here we have simple, just a couple of, in the School of Architecture Planning, I felt I had to put up at least some maps. We have Greater Mumbai, and you have Metro Manila. Mumbai, you may know already, is just a collection of islands that was built up. It was actually pretty much man-made. It was made by, I think, with original seven islands. And so the potential impact of climate change in Mumbai is completely unknown. What could happen because of the impact on hydrological level, and hence what would be the impact on Mumbai it's totally unknown, and it's one of the kind of the nightmarish kind of scenarios for Mumbai in 2100. Just a quick run through. Metro Manila and Greater Mumbai, there are comparabilities, but they have grown at different kind of speeds. You have a population beginning in the 60s and 70s comparable, and then by the time it came to 1975, you have 11.2 million in Manila, and Mumbai is around 14 million. Mumbai is slightly bigger in terms of the metropolitan population. Land area is comparable, and what is really interesting is this one, which of course most Mumbaikars would agree, but the government of India would stoutly disagree, is that you have close to 60% of people living in slums and squatter settlements in Mumbai. And this is from a government source itself. So this was not didn't go out with NGOs who love to kind of bat up these governments. So, and whereas Manila has done a much better job of having only 30%. That means they've had large-scale housing. And people may disagree, they may think that housing is really bad in Metro Manila. How many of you have been to Metro Manila? Oh, lovely, okay. So each section has one. Good, that's good. So the housing is not exactly the best, and they get flooded out, but still you have housing, unlike in Mumbai. And then you have the percentage of households with access to piped water, again, is abysmal in Mumbai, just over 40% piped water. And the total rainfall is pretty much the same, but what is important to recognize here is in the metropolitan Manila area, the rainfall is in 2 distinct seasons, so it's spread out over, so there is the same amount of rain, but there's less rain per month on an average, whereas in Mumbai, it is just in the southwest monsoon period, beginning in kind of early June through October, you have a fairly huge amount of rain coming down. So quickly, we'll walk you through these 2 case studies. Mumbai is known for its flooding. In fact, it would be really good to have, if there is tourism in India for, especially that used to be from the Middle East, for people who would go to India to look at the monsoon. They would kind of chasing the monsoon. How many of you have read Alexander Fraker's really good book on chasing the monsoon? So now we have a lot of Middle Eastern folks coming in to just feel the monsoon. We should also have an annual pilgrimage to Mumbai to look at the flooding, to see how little human beings learn from our own mistakes. So this happens. So all I'm saying is flooding in Mumbai is a normal affair. Mumbaikars, the people of Mumbai are pretty much, they're okay with flooding because they say, well, that's one of the costs of just living in Mumbai, okay? And report after report talks about how every year you have chronic flooding in big parts of Bombay, and especially of the commuting lines, the railway lines. But as a result of this, there's a very strong institutional mechanism. They've done a really good job of actually putting together a really good state-managed disaster emergency kind of response system that works well. And that is when there is a disaster. So this emergency response system in Bombay is one of the finest in the world, where, as I can just attest, that all of these arrows do work, and you have the fire, the police, the civil defense, the army, they all kind of really do come together when it really matters. And this is, as a state-run enterprise, it is a really good one. It's really good, and now there has been some opening up to bring in NGOs and CSOs and so on. Okay, so my sense is I think you can get copies of this, so not to worry. So you can get copies of the presentation, at least my presentation. So, but what happened in 2005, if you know, was Mumbai experienced unusually heavy rainfall. In 24 hours, in a matter of 24 hours, you almost had 1 meter of rain. So, a lot of scientists kind of went crazy trying to figure out, has there ever been a historic precedence? And some of them came up with, yes, there has been, but there hasn't been. But clearly in modern memory, there has never been any such. So a meter of rainfall in 24 hours. And this led to a key arterial overflowing, Methi River, which is now a big drain, but that kind of overflowed. And the suburbs were under 15 feet of water. I mean, it's just stunning. Some of those, you may have seen some of the pictures. It's just amazing that you have a 3-story building, half of it is underwater. And the only reason they stood is in India, the buildings, not the slums and squatter settlements, but the buildings that are built are made with the brick and mortar. You don't have the wooden structures that we have here as residential places, so they did stand. And you have, for a financial capital of the country, this is simply unacceptable that they had over 630 people dead. Tens of thousands of residential buildings and commercial buildings had to be vacated, and for months at a time. So the economic loss to the city and hence to the country was huge, in the billions of dollars. But the key to note is, I think even more catastrophic impacts could have happened if not for the emergency system. So this is not to kind of beat them down to say, oh, you guys didn't do your job well. I think they did a brilliant job in taking what could have been a far more kind of catastrophic impacts and turning it into something that, even though it's unacceptable, at least had a kind of a semblance in the scale of deaths, had a semblance of, yes, there is a certain acceptance even by Mumbaikars. So the key findings, after this there was a whole slew of studies. Following a disaster, it's almost kind of it's a kind of a sociological need to have studies all over the world. So you had, you had like 15 or 20 different studies funded by different people. But the key findings were interesting. The key findings were a combination of what is climate and non-climate. But this part was not recognized. The key findings were, all of them said, oh, this is because of climate change. And then also because George Bush was the president here, that didn't help matters. They all kind of said, oh, look, because of that guy, we're all having all this trouble, Kyoto Protocol. And so there's a massive amount of public debate on what developed countries need to do on climate change, because this is a manifestation of climate change impact that's happening right in our backyard in Bombay. But also the key engineering, kind of more engineering-minded studies went into and looked at the drainage. And that was abysmal. That was completely inadequate. Drainage that was over 100 years old was designed for 25 millimeters per hour, which again, as you rightly pointed out, is a cost-benefit ratio. Okay, if you could have a 1 meter per hour drainage, but the thing is it costs a lot more. And then you have intergenerational equity issues coming up. So here it was 25 millimeters per hour, and this 1 meter completely overwhelmed the system. But even more important was the drainage was designed when you had most of Bombay was not built up. But over the last century, a lot of the Bombay, what we now call as Mumbai, has been built up. There has been massive land use changes that the old holding ponds have been built over, and then you have encroachment of slums. There is a lot more concretization that has gone on, which means there is a huge increase in water flows which then the drainage system has to handle. So not only the drains were not designed well enough for just the 1 meter of rain, even if the rest of the system was okay, but you also had the land use change that resulted in even more kind of flow of water. So that was kind of Mumbai to highlight how it's reactive, how they move from one crisis to another, and the ability to step back and look at the whole system is very difficult for them. They would rather point to, oh, this is because of climate change, and then we need to do something about climate change, rather than saying, okay, we really need to plan very differently. In a very different light, you have the reactive urban management again in Angat. Angat supplies Metro Manila's water supply. It's a hugely important dam. It's not one of the largest reservoirs in Manila. It's one of the, in Philippines, it's one of the smaller ones. But it's hugely important because it supplies 97% of water to Metro Manila. And it also has a modest amount of irrigation water, 30,000 hectares. And it also supplies some hydropower to the Luzon province and helps control floods. But here, well, I think we can skip. This is just to show that in October through December, it gets most of the inflows. El Nino, many of you have heard of the El Nino, La Nina. We are right now going through a La Nina phase. El Nino is, this is just to orient, this is Australia, Papua New Guinea, and that is Central America. So this is the Pacific. So when you have a heating of the Pacific, the sea surface temperature rises beyond a certain level, then it has what's known as the El Nino, and this has global implications for climate. And this is a naturally occurring phenomenon. This has nothing to do really with climate change. Climate change may impact El Nino and it may behave very differently. But some people are now, especially some of the students that I have, say, oh, El Nino, that's because of climate change. Then you say, no, El Nino is a naturally occurring phenomenon. And here, this is just to show that El Nino happening in the Pacific actually has important teleconnections rest of the world. And I also use it because it's a pretty arresting graphic. So what happened here is over the Philippines, that part of the Philippines where you have Angat, there is in El Nino period, there is the huge decline in rainfall, leading to loss of water flowing into the reservoir. And because of the policy of impounding water for Metro Manila, even though it was raining early on, the farmers were told no for water because the Metro Manila really needs to have water. So there was no irrigation June through December of all of 97, and all of 98 there was no irrigation. And the farmers, I'll walk you through the system where they're supposed to be compensated, but they don't get compensated. No power generation, and then because El Nino 97 turned into 98 La Nina, they had too much water, and so to protect the safety of the dams, they raised and they had to spill the water, so the farmers got flooded out. So you have the system is based on a well worked out, rational kind of engineering based kind of rational decision making system, which is what happens here on the kind of the top of the slide. That you have a very well worked out system where you have a technical working group which is highly skilled, meets every month to comes up with should be the nature of the water release from Angat Reservoir, and that is what is supposed to happen. But actually what happens is, and this is all under the Philippine Water Code, what actually happens is, and this is not a corruption of the system, because there is a sense that when people study developing country institutions, if they don't work as you expect them to, there's a sense of either they're inefficient, or they're just simply no good, or they're just kind of corrupt, making money on the side, or just not even being around in their offices. This Angat is a really well run system. But what happens is, power plays a huge role in the way the system is managed. And in this case, it's very simple. The Philippines, the center of power is Metro Manila. Unlike in most other parts of the developing world, the rural areas in the Philippines don't wield too much political power. It is Metro Manila and its populations. And once Metro Manila folks get enraged and they walk out of the street, the president pretty much has to scoot. So what has happened is the policy has been to keep water, to hold water back for Metro Manila, because you do not want to ration water for Metro Manila. So you're keeping water for Metro Manila, even if it is raining, and even if they know, even if the forecasts, IRF forecasts suggest that you have to release the water, they don't, because they want to avoid, they don't have an incentive to take that risk, okay? And you have other aspects that are detailed out here, how each one of these institutions have their own stake in how to run Angat. And then depending on who wins out every season, you have the farmers mostly getting shafted. They never get kind of enough water. And the Philippine Water Code suggests that the farmers need to be compensated, but there is no regulation. And they're not going to have any regulation because they just don't have enough money in the central kitty to be compensating farmers for if they don't get water. So powerful institutions, each one of them in their own interest, externalize the costs. So you have the power of Metro Manila to safeguard water resources. They always invoke water scarcity under the Philippine Water Code, even if it's rainy, even if it's normal, and the farmers are not compensated. And as a result, farmers experience high variability of water, but water supply to Metro Manila all these years has been fairly stable and increasing. So then the question is, what happens when you have Angat in a climate change scenario, which we have worked there with them. And it's interesting that we need to then take into account not just climate that is changing, but also the growth scenarios. That is, the growth of Metro Manila projecting out, you have increased water demand plus the increased frequency of dry spells, which is most likely going to happen, will lead to declines in water availability, and continued land use changes plus increase in above normal will result in flooding. So they're going to get both. Some years they're going to get drought, some years they're going to get flooding. And again, the same thing is increased paved area, as it happened in Mumbai, can lead to less groundwater recharge, hence can lead to flooding. But the key is, even if you model Angat, and even if you run Angat in the best possible way that science demands, Angat can only supply water. There is a supply threshold by around 2020. So then even if you have Angat run in the best way, you will not have enough water for all of the multiple uses. So it's actually right now that you need to begin to plan infrastructure at least 20 years in advance, way ahead of the system, knowing full well that there are certain uncertainties associated with not only the climate, but also on the socioeconomic front. I mean, what's the population per capita? They're very aggressive. They want to actually have far higher per capita water available for the Manila folks. But the key is that we're going to have Angat alone is not going to do, and focusing on climate change alone is not going to solve the problem for Metro Manila. So now the last two slides. So adapting to climate change, you need to really have a set of kind of core issues, core values. One is you need to integrate with existing city planning and management processes, not to kind of somehow have a tabula rasa saying, oh, everything is clear, let's start with new institutions. Okay, we really need to have, what are the existing institutions, what is the way they manage risks. You need to include benefits for today as well as the future. You're going to lose your policymakers if you just focus on 100 years out, okay? Because that's 2 generations out, and the focus is really on the current generation. So you need to be inclusive of timescales. And you need to have, on the science side, you need to have spatially congruent information on climate that is congruent to decision making. You can't have global scale models to help you better manage Manila. Then there is a whole series of institutional incentives, inertia that one needs to kind of begin to explore, which we have done in our work. And as the previous speaker was saying, we need to deal with probabilities. There is no such thing as a certainty that this will happen this year, this will not happen. It's all the probabilities. And hence, really key is to focus on the intra and intergenerational equity. When you're talking of 50 years out infrastructure, who pays? The people who pay now. So what's in it for them? So that kind of participatory planning processes really are at the heart of how to adapt to climate change. For in our work at the Earth Institute, and in the institute where I'm in, IRI, we have a whole kind of lot of these specific projects and efforts globally, all over the world. And since you'll get a copy of this, and you can also should feel free to go to our website and quickly skim. It's just how to kind of improve, better manage, improve climate risks today, identify possible kind of scenarios, especially over 5 to 30 years where there's a lot of policy traction, and continually integrated the updated information, whether it's climate, socioeconomic, into your planning, rather than say, okay, we need to wait for. So rather than do kind of just modeling exercises, we do a lot of actually working with policymakers. We have a lot of projects that actually work with policymakers in early warning system with IFRC, which is a global project. We have agriculture in India, fire early warning system in Indonesia, a really good one in malaria early warning system in Botswana. And now there is a new one that we have just introduced, Earth Institute's. It's a really good program on global network for climate solutions. It has both a mitigation component as well as adaptation, and Scott Barrett, many of you may know, is leading the mitigation component. and this, the entire project is led by Professor Jeffrey Sachs. So all of these are available on the web at Columbia. I invite your participation, and maybe during the discussion if you have any issues, or if not, later on. So thank you again.
Thank you for that compelling talk. The next speaker is Richard Matthew, who's Associate Professor of International and Environmental Politics in the Schools of Social Ecology and Social Science at the University of California at Irvine, and founding director of the Center for Unconventional Security Affairs. He's a world authority on the environmental dimensions of conflict and peace building, and he's been extensively published. Thank you.
Thank you. And do I... Well, it's a pleasure to be here, and I should probably start off by saying that most of the work that I've been doing, and I don't use the term global environmental crisis or catastrophe, so I sort of agreed to that title for this talk and thought I'd think about it a little bit, but it's not a term that most of my work has been in very specific areas. I've worked as a researcher and for quite a long time with the UN's post-conflict and disaster branch, and it's been work in Congo, Sierra Leone, Rwanda, Nepal, and Pakistan. Those are the 5 areas where I've spent a lot of the past 15 years. So I have a bit of a bleak view about the world. I've seen the tremendous strength and resilience of people operating under very adverse conditions, but also have a sense of the huge challenge of redirecting or reorienting global trends that play a role in reproducing and intensifying some of those adverse conditions. But I haven't talked much about, or at all about, global environmental crisis. I'm going to talk a little bit about these things up here. And I want to start by saying, the past couple of months, we have seen an awful lot of disasters. I think the earlier speakers are quite correct. Climate change scientists do not say that the massive flooding in Pakistan, China, India, the fires in Russia, all from August, that these would not have occurred if there were less greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. What they do say is that these things are consistent with the types of weather outcomes that they would expect from climate change. And there's tremendous confusion about what climate change is. For some people, this is an enduring change in the statistical characteristics of climate. For other people, there is no comparison group. This is a unique phenomenon. They look at they try and build a comparison group with massive asteroid strikes and volcanic activity that eradicated 95% of the biosphere millions and millions of years ago. And as a result, I think that people are often quite confused about, is this climate change or is this not climate change? After 15 years of intense efforts to educate the public, we discovered that a lot of people still aren't really sure what's global warming, what is ozone depletion, what is air pollution, that a quarter of the people in the US, a quarter of the people in Britain are skeptical that it's even happening, and that in this country, roughly the same number of people who think gay marriage is the greatest threat to our national security believe that climate change is. So there's a lot of confusion, and I'm not going to, but I think that there's enough disaster that we don't have to determine now whether it's caused by climate change or something else. And if we look here at what happened in Pakistan as the flooding of the Indus River in August, and these massive amounts of rain falling in cities like Peshawar in a 24-hour period, and really, as the earlier speaker talked about Mumbai, huge amounts of rain falling in very short periods of time, and causing, in this case, we know some 21 million people to be affected, a fifth of the country's land surface flooded, 1 million homes destroyed, and so on and so forth. So we see these huge things. Will they aggregate into a global environmental disaster? I'll talk about that shortly. I'll also return back to here. Certainly, urban areas are vulnerable to lots of things. They're vulnerable to pollution. They're vulnerable to resource scarcities. They're vulnerable to the things that we think of as climate change effects. They're vulnerable to massive numbers of people. I spent quite a lot of time in Kathmandu. I just, earlier this week, tried to confirm some of these numbers with a colleague of mine who lives there and is known for this work. And he was telling me that right now Kathmandu has about 3.5 million people in it, many of them driven because into the capital because there aren't livelihoods for them elsewhere. But the infrastructure of the city can only really serve about 1.5 million people. So there's about 2 million people too many, and as a result, sanitation's overwhelmed, water is only on for a few hours a week, energy, there are lots of blackouts, and people take to the streets and they protest when they don't have water. They set car tires on fire and they cause massive traffic jams and so on and so forth. This is Kathmandu, and these images of air pollution and of trash are really very, very common. You don't have to go very far in Kathmandu to see these sorts of things. Elsewhere, I've spent a lot of time in Rwanda. If there's a group of people who might qualify as the worst off people in the world, it would probably be pygmies in the Great Lake region. This is a pygmy flood camp. And this is 18 months after they were flooded out of their homes. So you get these sort of situations where there are disasters, they move people, another disaster comes up, the country's resources shift, the people continue to sort of be waiting for assistance. Goma, another city that I've spent a lot of time in the Congo, and years after the volcanic explosions, the city is still waist deep in lava, and that's only one of the numerous problems that have plagued this part of the world. Water shortages. I just took this picture a few months ago in Sierra Leone, where you have enormous problems. Are these linked to climate change? I don't even think that's the key question right now. The question is, what are we going to do? Urban areas are very vulnerable to all these sorts of things. They're also they also contribute to these things. Right now we have half the world's population living in urban areas, but they are responsible for somewhere between 65 to 80% of the consumption of resources and of the generation of greenhouse gases and of waste. So we have a small, we have clearly an inequity here. You're probably familiar with the ecological footprint literature, and it points out that a city like New York draws down resources, the 8 million people in New York draw down the resources of an area the size of France. London, the resources that it utilizes require an area of 120 times its actual size. So as we see the trend, and of course demographic trends are not predictions, they're just, this is a possibility, but we can see as many as 3.1 billion people being added, this is the median prediction, to urban areas over the course of this century before population stabilizes as at least some demographers expect it to do. So these things, cities play an enormous role. They are a driving force behind resource scarcity, behind pollution, behind what we understand to be climate change and biodiversity loss. And if you look, I'm sure anybody who's traveled through the world, here you have small units that are largely self-sustaining, and their footprint is much smaller than, that looks like my place in California, sadly, although I don't have a swimming pool. But but the footprint of urban life is very, very large, maybe 100 to 200 times the actual land that's available in urban areas. So, okay, given we have this problem where urban settings are vulnerable to all sorts of environmental problems, and they're also contributing to these, can we be talking about a global environmental catastrophe? A catastrophe is generally defined as some sort of large-scale disaster, and a disaster, I'm sure you're all familiar with it, but it's a function of if an earthquake in Antarctica is not considered a disaster if it doesn't affect anybody or any human values. So it's a question of how vulnerable we are, and that depends on exposure. So if you're asking how vulnerable are you to skin cancer, are you exposed to sunlight, are you sensitive, do you have very fair skin, and what sort of capacity do you have to protect yourself? Do you have access to sunscreen and so on and so forth? And clearly, geography and wealth play an enormous role in determining vulnerability. Right now, the biggest migration is into coastal cities, and coastal cities are largely located in areas that are particularly vulnerable to a lot of the environmental challenges that we've been outlining. It also seems that generally speaking, the poor have considerably less capacity to reduce their vulnerability to these things. Can we imagine a disaster on the scale of a planetary disaster? Well, some people do, but I do want to give you an example. This is a picture I took in the summer of a village in Sierra Leone, which is on a mining concession, and as the mining company has expanded, it is moving these people who have lived there for many generations into an area which is extremely vulnerable. I mean, they're moving them into an area which has exposure to every sort of problem. And the people are saying, well, why? We're not going to go. We're going to fight them. But ultimately, they are going to go. They are going to be moved into this area where they're exposed to disaster. There are sort of three views on whether we should be talking about global environmental disaster. There are a group of people who think that we should. Tad Homer Dixon is famous for this. So is E.O. Wilson at Harvard, sort of saying it's not what we're talking about. We should be talking about what are we going to do, because we are already on that pathway. We probably have already crossed critical thresholds. The driving trends towards this global environmental catastrophe are largely immovable. We have already seen biodiversity loss take place. We are already seeing greenhouse gas emissions take place. We are already seeing things. We are in the sixth great extinction. That is already underway. We are already there. So we should be thinking about recovery from this as it gets worse and worse. But for people who are in a state of denial and still saying, well, this is a manageable problem, or it's only one of many problems. We have the economic crisis, and we have disease curtains, and we have terrorism, and this is only one. They're simply not looking at the data accurately. They're simply trying to contextualize, and every discipline is trying to contextualize these problems in a way which makes them seem smaller and manageable than they really are. The problems are actually enormous, and they really should be the focus of our attention. You have another group of people, sort of diametrically opposed, Bjorn Lomborg is famous for this, who say, yeah, these are real problems, but the fact is this is not the end of the world. We're going to be able to adapt, we're going to be able to innovate, we're going to be able to deal with these things. We should not overinvest, we should not dramatize the problems or overinvest in the solutions. We should accept that lots and lots of signals are coming into communities at different levels, and communities are responding bit by bit, and the future is not at all bleak. There's a third view. On Tuesday, I was at the State Department doing a briefing, and I gave a briefing about the environmental situation on the planet, and the person behind me was an economist, and there were three of us doing these briefings, and he said, listen, it's very interesting, all this talk about environmental change and climate change, but he said, and I like he's referring to me, he said the last speaker had some interesting things to say, but let me put this into context for you. The overall trend of the planet is extremely positive. Asia is recovering rapidly from economic crisis. It is going to continue to recover. What I predict is decades of strong growth in China, of India and Indonesia taking off. What we should be doing is positioning ourselves for a very, very vital and growth-oriented global economy. And these problems, we need to put them into context. They are affecting, yes, millions of people. It sounds dramatic, but there are millions of very poor people being affected out of billions of people who mostly are doing fairly well. And so we don't want to overstate. And this view, it's not a view that is out there as easily, because it sort of says the conclusion of it, and the conclusion of this person's briefing was, what we want to do is try and keep those disasters localized as much as possible. We want to try and keep them micro-level phenomenon and not let them seep in. We learned from SARS what happened. SARS imposed enormous economic costs on the planet. And countries like Canada said, hey, there are advisories, don't travel to Canada, don't come to Canada right now. And they said, we are not an exporter of SARS. Only one case of SARS has been exported from Canada. We have it fully under control in our hospitals in Toronto. It is completely under control. Don't stigmatize. This was during the height of the controversy. They said, the problem, put some restrictions on travel to Thailand or China if you want, but don't pull us into this economic nightmare, because we're not exporting SARS. It is not a problem. It's a problem we have. And the view of these economists was we've got to maintain that situation. We can't let these dramatic moments sort of color our policy decisions and so on. We've got to be able to do what it takes to contain disasters and not allow them to become global phenomena. Not so much in the E.O. Wilson, Homer Dixon sense where everything dies, but more in the sense of economic shocks rippling through the entire system, posing bigger and bigger costs on us. Costs that today are in the tens of billions of dollars, costs that could mount if we don't contain them into the hundreds of billions or trillions of dollars if we're not careful. And so their advice was, look, it is not pleasant to be poor and equatorial today, given the sort of environmental stresses that we face, but don't let this divert us away from the very, very happy picture we have of a planet that's living longer and making much more money. Climate change is going to impose great costs on some people, but create great opportunities for other people. It is going to open up resources, it's going to improve productivity in Canada and parts of Russia and the United States and parts of South America and Australia, and we should be very careful. The key is damage control. And if you look at it, you look at the disasters, this is disasters from the most recent period I could get a map, and you see them heavily concentrated in certain areas. If you look at the countries that are most vulnerable, this is 2010 list of the countries that are most vulnerable to environmental disasters. A very sort of predictable group of countries in many ways because of their conditions, because of poverty, because of the capacity to reduce vulnerability. What isn't suggested, what isn't out there yet, is the argument that cities have a large role to play in determining the future. And that's what I want to suggest here. I'm not going to take a position on whether we're already well into a global catastrophe or whether we have multiple ways of adapting to this, or whether really it's a question of if you're poor and in the wrong place, life is going to be really rotten over the next 50 years. But if you're rich and in the right place, it's actually going to be pretty good. Clearly, cities have some potential. They have enormous capacity and leverage to shape some of these outcomes. Urban design could be, and this is an argument that you don't hear very often in policy circles. In fact, you don't hear arguments about environment and climate change in senior policy circles anyway these days. Why that is hard to know, but the focus is on the economy, just as it is here. But urban design does have this capacity to operate on sort of the same time frames that those medium term, those multi-decade time frames that business and government are not able to do. And so we can imagine cities making the decision to reduce their environmental footprints dramatically. We can imagine them focusing on ways to reduce the vulnerability of those people who are living in the slums or in those cities that are poorly positioned such that their vulnerability is much greater through basic development strategies and better use of scientific information, climate proofing, a term that doesn't mean climate proof. It means taking steps that reduce some of the anticipated impacts of because obviously, as we've learned, we can't be climate proof, but this is not an end state. This is a process. Mitigating the harm. The other thing I think is that what we have is a system which has found very clever ways to displace the problems and in either to project them into the future or to displace them into areas where people can't resist them very well. And it isn't just sort of putting our dirty plants across the border into Mexico. It is, generally speaking, we have found this image. Here we have a small village in Sierra Leone. A few years ago was an agricultural village. Price of gold went up in the world market, and so people stopped farming and turned to gold mining. They made a little bit of money, but they exhausted the mining, and now they've got basically a destroyed environment, no more gold, and no idea of what to do. And so we met with them, and they said, we don't know what to do. We have absolutely no prospects right now. And this woman said, will you take a picture of me and make sure you include it? And she said, gold mining used to be a woman's occupation in Sierra Leone. It was, a way in which we built up some insurance in case of disaster. And when prices went up, men took it over. Now it's exhausted, and so we're doubly disadvantaged. We've lost our historic insurance policy. The agricultural potential of the region is destroyed because of the mines. We don't know what to do. There certainly is this sense of you know, the world market having these dramatic impacts on the micro level. And I think it is an important question whether we, like my economist friend at the State Department, whether we feel that we can tolerate that. That's acceptable. That's an acceptable level of collateral damage to basically a very robust global economy, or whether we're going to you know, try to do things to reduce that. And I think that's we have gridlock in most of the capitals of the world, so cities are going to play a role in deciding how they're going to be involved in these global processes. I think there's a huge sort of unexplored opportunity for cities to start to become conscious of their linkages, of the ways in which they're linked to the rest of the world, and how they want to manage those connections, and whether they do want to focus on protecting green wealth out there and focus on you know, using their critical mass to make green technologies viable, and using their leverage in areas like procurement to shift the economy and these sorts of things. Whether they want to reduce their footprint, reduce the vulnerability of their poor, reduce their tendency to displace problems into the weaker areas of the world. Thank you very much, and like everybody else, I'll be around for questions if
Right, so I was just looking for Saskia there, see whether or not we've got time for. Do we have time for a few questions to the panel, or we are a bit over time? Okay, fantastic. So, are there? If the panelists just come back onto the table, we'll just take a few questions from the audience, and then ask them the panelists to respond to those ones they would like to respond to. Okay, so there's is there a roving microphone at all? Or are we going to? Okay, I'll do my best to. Is there a roving microphone? Okay, there's a question down here at the front.
Yeah, my question is to any of you. It seems obvious that a more proactive position has to be taken, but given the timescales, how can this really be effective without totalitarianism?
I'll just take another couple of questions if there are any. Are there any more in the auditorium? There's one over here, and the gentleman in the green shirt.
Yeah, my question is for, as far as I'm aware, it's been pretty well established that sort of big infrastructure projects have a sort of feedback loop where you build the dike and it reduces the sort of perceived risk for people behind the dike, and then it reduces sort of capital investment behind it, and then that in turn increases the flow rate. I know that this has been pretty, it's been taken into consideration in the Netherlands through policies like rules of the river and things like that. And I was wondering if this feedback loop is included in your games, your model.
Okay, and one last question. Is there another one? Okay, well, I'll just summarize those. So that's either and or totalitarianism and implementing strategies for climate change in cities. And the other one is obviously feedback loops when thinking about complex engineering problems, specifically within cities. So if I just ask the panel, just starting with you.
Yeah. I've been thinking about that. It's going around a lot. They call it the spiral of risk. You protect yourself better, so you invest more, potential damage grows, and the risk would increase. Mathematically, that is not necessarily the case, but try to work it out for yourself. And socially, when you how do you call that? Unwrap the reasoning, I could sort of say to you, like, why are you trying to get you're probably like a bigger room, and then a house, and then you buy a house, and then maybe a bigger house, and then a nicer car, and I can say, well, but then you become more vulnerable because you can lose all that. What are you doing? Why are you doing that? And maybe you do think that that is actually wrong, and maybe you don't do all that, but I do. I like, honestly, I like, to live well. So don't you think that that's actually this issue that you're addressing? So my response to that is we're caught in spirals of risks. Face it.
Andrew?
Well, on the question of authoritarianism, there's no doubt that open pluralist societies probably are vulnerable in two sorts of ways. One, to certain types of transnational threats because of their openness. And second, in mobilizing an effective response because of their pluralism. So that it is hard to come up with an optimal climate policy in the United States when you have so many competing interests that a government has to be attentive to. On the other hand, they do have an enormous stock of innovation and vitality. We think of social entrepreneurs and social pioneers and this type of movement, and a tremendously powerful sort of citizenry, which has technological skills, tools that are unprecedented. In a way, we have the most powerful generation of citizens in history, even while we may have, a government that is very, very, it's very difficult to take on big restructuring, big reform types of projects, whether it's in healthcare or climate change or education or anything else. So it's not clearly the case that a pluralist democratic society is the wrong place to be. I think that there are strengths and weaknesses to it, nor is it obvious. While Singapore could respond very quickly to SARS and did so, and Canada had a much more difficult time doing so, it's not clear that which was ultimately the better route. And it's not clear that China, which has enormous problems, is going to be able to solve its internal tensions more effectively than the United States can. So I think there isn't a clear victor. I do know that some of the people like Homer Dixon, who are associated with thinking that we're really well into the crisis, feel that if we had a more technocratic group of elites managing things and with a little bit more freedom, that we might negotiate the future more effectively.
Shiv?
I'll take the same thing a little bit differently in a couple of ways. One is, given the sheer diversity of reasons why we got where we are and the diversity of impacts that climate kind of plays out as one of the key drivers of development, you have all these other development risks. I think totalitarian as a system of governance would be the very last thing we should be thinking about, because I think one of the failures of the UN FCCC, the UN system, is the search for one single large policy. That, I think, is now finally being kind of given up, because it just means very different things to very many different people across the world. Reducing greenhouse gas emissions for Australian farmer is very different, say, from a farmer in Sierra Leone to a utility manager in Bolivia to one in New England. So that they mean very different things. So that's, I think, one. But the second would be, and this I kind of toss it back to you, the very approach that all of us have bought into, which is development is progress, or progress is development with a capital D. That itself is totalitarian in its scope, vision. And we have at the margin people kind of talking about, well, we need to work differently, we need to have a different form of development. And I think that so far has failed to kind of generate the kinds of real world policies. I think there's a lot of very good debates going on in academia, but for many reasons it has failed to kind of get into kind of policy making. And one of the most interesting innovations now is in Bhutan, and I think many of you from Colombia may have heard the discussion by the Prime Minister, is this idea of maximizing gross happiness. Okay, which for many reasons, initially it was kind of, people reacted with a sense of, are these guys for real? There must be a lot of marijuana there, so these guys are clearly out. So even in World Bank, IMF circles, they were with a sense of dismay. But now it's interesting how in the last 15, 20 years, there has been kind of steady inroads made into kind of serious economic policy making as the idea, if not just of economic growth, which we all reject, even though we all want it, to Human Development Index. All of us would like to have better quality of life, human development, HDIs of UNDP and so on. But now the next big jump in policy is, okay, what does it mean? And this is not in the psychological sense of what does it mean to be happy, or we're condemned, or Freudian view of happiness or unhappiness. This is really material basis of happiness. So maybe that's another way to kind of look at how to get out of this kind of totalitarian vision of what constitutes development.
Okay, thank you. Oh, we're going to have to wrap up now. So I'm just going to summarize cities and eco-disasters. What can we do? Well, today we've learned that, firstly, it's complex and pan-disciplinary. Secondly, cities do play a very important role, especially in medium-term solutions and transgenerational approaches. And finally, scientists are actually willing to make the move from projection to prediction, but only after the Mayan calendar has completed its cycle. And thank you very much. Come back at 1:30 and we'll start the afternoon session then, please.